I thought we would kick off by thinking about, really for you, looking at Bill's career, thinking about these works, what makes them so significant to both a turning point in his life and also what was to come afterwards?
Well, I think that you have to bear in mind that these wilderness paintings, that's the dried lake to over there, over here, the Wivenhoe painting, this pale, large painting over here, that they were shown at the Dryan Galleries and then the Tooth Galleries in London in the late 50s and early 60s. And they launched Bill on the London scene. He'd had an exhibition in Soho with a couple of friends, and The World and His Wife in avant-garde London arts at that time had come in and seen it. But it was in the Parton Gallery, which was a publisher's gallery. And he was taken up by the Dryan Gallery by Halima Nalic, Polish owner, and then by the Tooth Gallery. And these paintings just seemed to walk off the wall. So they clearly had a real sense of moment at that time, that they meant something. They struck a chord with people at that time.
Yeah. So what we have in the exhibition here is predominantly paintings from around 1958 to about 1962 or thereabouts.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because those two dates, they bookend two really important events in the non-art world, which were very important for Bill. 58 was the first Aldermaston March. Bill had married in 1954 into a Scottish socialist pacifist family. And he was related by marriage to the peace campaigner Lord Ritchie Calder, who introduced him to Bertrand Russell and the rest of them, and Bill took part in that 58 march. He was a lifelong pacifist, and there was something which had come out of his generation, post-war. It really affected his thinking. And 62 is the other bookend, because that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And reading through Bill's letters to family and friends at that time, it's full of references to Castro and Khrushchev, etc. So I think that these extraneous elements, I think they were really important.
Well, we definitely over the next 45 minutes or so want to dig into how the expression of some of these circumstances was in a type of landscape painting that probably is hard to find a cognate to or a comparison to in the painting of the time, but also think more about how Crozier's mindset, his existentialism, his feeling of where the world was, fed into these paintings. But I thought before we do that, because there's something interesting here, which is that, in a sense, for me, these are pivotal paintings in one artist's career, but he wasn't an emerging artist straight out of art school. So I thought we could dig back 10 years and, just for the audience's sake, give a bit more detail of where Bill came from, what he'd done at art school, what he'd done in the intervening decade. He was still a young man when he painted these, but born in 1930. By 1958, obviously, he's in his late 20s. He's not just coming out fresh, and he had experimented with different things before and worked in different places. So, I mean, if we just start by thinking a little bit about Bill's own artistic training. At age 15, I think he already had decided he wanted to be a painter.
Completely, and there are photographs of him at school, and as in the art room, committed and painting sort of quasi-surrealist paintings at the age of 17, 18 in Marr College in Troon. From there he moves to Glasgow School of Art. And Glasgow School of Art in the late 40s early 50s when he was there. It was incredibly traditional training. So Bill described it as, in the drawing classes you learn to draw like Ingres, in the painting classes you learn to draw like Delacroix. And
they're quite good draftspeople.
Pretty damn good. But he I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, in the drawing classes, he meets people in Glasgow. So 49 to 53, he's at Glasgow School of Art.
Yes.
Is that a very formative experience, or is it a bit like doing your, going through the motions and graduating there? Do we have a sense of what he felt he learned there?
Enormously respectful throughout his life for the people who taught him, David Donaldson, Mary Armour, these Scottish artists, and he recognised that they'd given him a colossal sense of craft, as well as an enormous work ethic. That if you arrived at 9:05, he tells me, although Bill was prone to exaggeration, but if you arrived at 9:05, you were marked as absent. You had to be there 9 o'clock on the dot, and you painted through. And then from 6 till 9 at night, you were drawing. And this was 5 days a week. And it was a training to be a tradesman, if you like, as well as this high calling of artist. Mm. But it was very conventional, very Beaux-Arts atelier training. And I think the other thing that Glasgow gave him was a sense and a love of, if you like, the matière, the belle peinture ideas of French art, which he never lost.
Well, I suppose this is the other place one of the other places where his education takes place is Paris, and his first trip to Paris as a very young man, really.
Yeah, 16. And there's a very, very grey, wobbly photograph in existence of this gauche young man, teenager, standing by a 1940s Picasso. And you can see almost the reverence in his eyes. But Bill I think he was enormously fortunate that Glasgow, because Glasgow had been so bombed during the war, the Council of Europe and the British Council decided that, almost as a thank you in the post-war years, that they sent the very big European exhibitions to Glasgow rather than to Edinburgh, where they might previously have gone. So Bill saw a tremendous exhibition of Picasso and Matisse, followed by one of Vincent van Gogh, followed by Munch. Now, if you can think of a group of artists likely to have had a greater resonance for Bill Crozier than those four, I think it's difficult to imagine.
I don't see Glasgow Council at the moment bringing those exhibitions along, but there's a sort of enlightening in Glasgow, but also this feeling of Paris. And it was a Paris that, it wasn't the roaring Paris of the 20s or even the pre-First World War years. It was still it was a Paris that was obviously very intellectually intense, but it was a Paris that was coming out of the war.
Oh, but it was that magic moment, that excitement of everything that was happening, certainly in philosophy. Bill then and throughout his life never spoke a word of French. So he had to read everything in translation. And he was a very shy man, which is sometimes not noticed about him. And therefore, he would be the last person to go up to Mr. Sartre and Madame de Beauvoir and say, "I'm so thrilled and delighted to meet you." I mean, he just wouldn't. But he was there and he felt that he was somehow imbibing everything.
Well, of course, the cafes like the de Magot, they were part of the theatre of Paris. And there is a story that at some point he saw Dora Maar in the street, and he felt he was seeing a painting that Picasso had constructed.
Yes. He said he saw this woman walking towards him, and she looked very recognizable, and he thought he must know her, but he couldn't possibly know her because he didn't know anyone in Paris. And then he recognized that it was Dora Maar, and he recognized her from a Picasso portrait.
So I suppose this is 47 and 1953. After he leaves Glasgow, he goes with his friend Bert Irvin, fellow artist, fellow painter, to Paris. But then these intervening years, still in the 1950s, he marries for the first time and goes to Dublin. And so I suppose, do we have a sense of, is he pursuing his own painting at this point? Because he has to obviously go and find work, and he acts as a set painter for many of the theatres in Dublin.
Yes. It is so frustrating that we don't have any of Crozier's work from the Dublin period. And yet I've got memoirs written by his family who say, oh, we went to stay with them and the entire apartment was painted over. And there were lots of his drawings around. I mean, we do know that he took in paintings and drawings to Victor Waddington in Dublin, who would put them by a braque on one side and a Miro on the other, put bills in the middle, and there'd be a sort of crit. So Bill described it as very humbling, but actually part of his education.
I suppose the Dublin at that time, he's there for more than a year, perhaps 18 months or so. And it's still, again, having had the philosophical Paris, it's a very literary Dublin still that he's immersing himself in, a relatively small city. And he meets people like Patrick Kavanagh, like Flann O'Brien,
Brendan Behan.
Yeah. And those are formative meetings.
Absolutely. It's interesting. People often ask me, you know, who were Bill's closest colleagues in art? And I have to say, well, actually, he had much closer friendships with poets than he ever did with fellow artists. And Kavanagh in particular was a huge, really formative influence on Bill. It was, I mean, at various stages in his life, Bill would talk about this moment of revelation looking at the landscape and how something that he'd seen that was instant and that was very local, that his task as a painter was to make something that was universal and had a larger meaning than that. All of that came from Kavanagh. Yeah.
The sort of the epic, as Kavanagh describes it, in the narrow patch of ground or in the local detail. And that is, I suppose, something that motivates a lot of perhaps these paintings, but also the later paintings. Did Dublin help him sort of work out where he stood in relation to his Irishness? He had grown up in Scotland, but had been going to the north of Ireland as a boy.
Yeah, I think that at that period in Bill's life, there was just a great fluidity between his sense of being Irish and his sense of being Scottish. There wasn't any hard divide. There wasn't any sense that he was abandoning Scotland or Scottishness by acknowledging the Irish part of his persona and his parentage. But he did use the period in Dublin and particularly a tour that he made around Ireland in the early 60s to get underneath the skin of the country, because to know Dublin is not to know Ireland. You know, it is very, very different elsewhere. And some of the figure paintings, like the Mayo girl down below and Ennis, is, you know, they come out of that 1962 trip.
He's back in London after that, and we will get to these paintings in Essex, but he sort of picks up in Soho, and there's interesting essays in one of the books about Crozier, which reminds you that in a few pubs and clubs in Hampstead, Soho and Chelsea at the time, you could just about, probably quite a few beers and so on see everybody who was anybody in the London art world in a day at that time. So he what is his entry into that world?
Well, he gravitated towards Soho via the two Roberts, Cahoon and McBride, who were very dear and very close friends, excuse me, from Scotland. And then as they were part of Soho, he joined them there. He also joined them in Essex, which is something which has come to light recently. But again, in Soho, he knew, he was very close to George Barker. Interestingly, I said, "How did you meet Francis Bacon?" And he said, "Oh, Stephen Spender said he'd introduce me." And so Spender did. And Bill had been so thrilled to meet this slightly older artist who he revered. And Bacon turned around and said, "He's not pretty." And Bill said he felt utterly mortified. Yeah.
So in terms of he's picked up by the Dryan Gallery, as you mentioned, and later by Arthur Tooth and Sons, a gallery that has a sort of incredible, strong revival in the 60s with the first exhibition of Ellsworth Kelly in London, solo exhibition, the first exhibition, I think it's 64, Howard Hodgkin in London as well. So a really important moment, and rather counter to the early emergence of pop, I suppose. That is when we think about those years of the 60s and slightly afterwards. But let's just take the trip to Essex now, because we've sort of set the scene. And it seems for an artist who suddenly had got to know all of these figures in Soho, it seems almost counterintuitive to decide to rent a cottage in North Essex by the Essex-Suffolk border for the winter of 1958. What is your sense of? I mean, why did he take that decision? And was it an artistic decision in any way?
No, it was a practical decision. It was so much cheaper to live there, and he had a wife and small child to look after. And he sublet a cottage from Marsh Dunbar, who was the wife of Peter Dunbar, the publisher and art writer. Bill's wife, Elspeth, and small son were deposited in this very primitive 16th century cottage. Bill stayed living in Soho, visiting them at the weekends. So I think it must have been hellish on all sides, to tell the truth.
Because it was quite a journey to get out there. So he had a studio above the Dryan Gallery.
Yeah.
And I suppose would pack up on a sort of Friday afternoon and head out
and go there. Yes, and nobody drove. I can't think of any of those artists who are connected with Essex in the 50s and early 60s. Nobody drove, so they were all dependent on public transport. And I can look at the map of Essex and Suffolk and think, oh yes, they were only 10 or 12 miles apart, but nobody seemed to see anybody very much because they were little separate nuclei.
Well, I suppose there are two versions of this. One is that there was the history of that North Essex and South Suffolk landscape and the sense that Gainsborough country is 5-10 miles up the road at Sudbury, and then Dedham Vale and Constable country, and that feeling of all of that tradition of English landscape there. And then on the other hand, looking at this painting of Wivenhoe here, that Dennis Worth Miller and Richard Chopping were there at Wivenhoe.
And Bacon had a house in Wivenhoe.
Cedric Morris and Let Haynes and all of the people around them were at Benton End in Hadley, really if you were driving not far up the road. But having done some work at Gainsborough's house recently, I could tell you that still if you don't drive, you have to take trains back through Colchester, and it will take you hours to get between any of these places. It's quite a sort of remote community of these little nodes that aren't really necessarily linked up to each other.
Yeah.
He didn't really feel, he was never in Essex part of a group. He never talked about his social life there.
No, he would see Kahuna McBride.
Mm-hmm.
He had stayed with them at Tilty Mill. And that's interesting because, one hears all these sort of extraordinary stories of the bohemian life of Tilty Mill with the writer Elizabeth Smart, who was based there. And I asked Bill about that once, and he said that his greatest memory was that Riven Todd, who was actually the owner of, or the chief tenant of Tilty Mill, had left his entire library behind. Riven Todd was the great Blake scholar. And Bill, he said, I used to spend evenings just reading my way through his library. He said it was bliss. And he learned so much about Blake. Yeah.
So, I mean, in 57, Bill had an exhibition at the Parton Gallery. You mentioned the Publishers Gallery, where the works have been shown at the RCA as well, so the ICA afterwards. He was making works out of found objects, and through chance he was throwing pieces of wood sometimes over walls and letting them land on canvases, attaching them.
Yes.
There was a feeling of sort of almost Dadaist chaos.
And this was three, Bill and two other contemporaries from Glasgow School of Art. And their first conception for this exhibition, which they called Stimulants, was that it should be completely temporary and it should be made entirely of food. And they were dissuaded from that by David Archer, who owned the premises. And so they came up with this idea called Stimulants, which will be of found objects and of bits and bobs.
What food do you think he would have put in that exhibition?
Really, probably from a Lion's Corner house. He would never have cooked it.
But I suppose I asked the question because then there's quite a movement into making these works. So thinking about what's here, I suppose we can differentiate to some degree between the works that are the landscape works and the works where the figure starts to emerge. They're obviously related paintings, they're related stylistically, they have related concerns. But you get a sense of where this line emerges from, this desire to paint these quite calligraphic landscapes. It was quite a departure.
Yeah, and Bill very consciously dissociated himself from that English landscape tradition. He had no truck with that phrase, spirit of place, which was so common in all the writing about the neo-romantic artists. He said, the spirit of place is what I bring to it, not something that's intrinsically in it. And he also took issue with the idea of landscape. He said, it's not really landscape in the sense of something that's rural or countryside. It's nature, it's environment. And that, I think, is very important looking at these images. And he believed fundamentally that his painting was based on something seen, even if just for a nanosecond, but something that had made a colossal impression on him. And then he'd move away from that actual scene and then contemplate and think of it in the studio. And in the studio never had any windows, or if it had windows, they were blocked out.
And I suppose one thing, unlike some of his peers at the time, he's not, I think, with these landscape paintings that we might put that in inverted commas, drawing, he's not doing any plein air sketching.
No, absolutely not.
He's not even necessarily a sort of rogue male striking out into the countryside and walking, but there's something seen, maybe from the windows of the cottage, maybe from the bus on the way up to Pebmarsh where this cottage is. There's something seen that registers and he carries back with him into the studio. One of the things that's very memorable, I think, about how he talked about his process later was that he had to stop, prepare everything, and then put the first mark down. And putting the first mark down often meant that the second, third, and so on would follow quite quickly. But he was quite a fast painter,
Yeah.
but only when he had started painting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's excuse me. Bill said that he was only a landscape painter. He said, if I can really be called a landscape painter, he said, landscape is not the subject. Landscape is the vehicle through which I can express emotions, feelings, a sense of loss. So all of these other things, all of these things which are to do with the human condition, if one can state it. That is the big difference. But that said, he describes looking out of a window at the cottage in Pedmarsh, where some of these were painted, and seeing how the farmers used to burn off the land after the crop was finished. And so you get these flames of and smoke in the landscape. And he said they just reminded him of the photographs he'd seen of the First World War. And so he immediately made these connections between it being something seen, but also with a greater resonance of something else.
And it wasn't just sort of mythopoeic. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't a sort of a mystical landscape of I suppose, the neo-romantics and continues.
Nothing
it's
like.
about that sense of his not just emotional but intellectual conditions, what he had been reading, thinking about Sartre. So one of the ways I think that this is expressed in some of these paintings is number one, to call them landscapes is it seems quite deliberate that so many of these paintings of an environment are painted what we would usually call portrait format, rather than, so he doesn't go, he's not thinking about vistas and vision, they're quite constrained, their edges are tight. That makes it, I mean, I'm looking at the Wivenhoe painting because it's in front of me. Often the horizon is pressing quite close to the top of the canvas, and I think if you see even the slightly later figure painting here, the horizon is right up at the top. There's something sort of off balance. He's kind of obviously obsessed with edges and horizons, and the horizon meeting the edge, that feeling of striking out, of not knowing what is over that edge.
And also space which is tilted up from that high horizon to meet us. That's a real trait in Bill's paintings.
You sometimes get a sense of a tree in the landscape, a bush, a hedge, contours or undulations, but it's a relatively flat landscape around there, which also is something that makes it challenging. It's not picturesque or sublime in the way that any romantic subject, romantic painter would take it up and be able to frame it. Well, I just very quickly, Catherine, because one of the things I think is interesting is that you mentioned it's tilted up, but it's never quite clear whether you are seeing something almost from above, like an aerial view, or whether you are seeing a view from a window, so slightly raised, or in some cases whether you're starting to actually see almost a cross-section or imagined cross-section of the land and the layers and strata of it. Because as you start to see the putative forms of figures in it, you wonder whether they're buried figures or not, and whether there's earth here going on, or roots that are somehow underneath the ground. So it's disorienting in that way.
I think another possible reference, I only say that it is possible, is that if you look at photographs of Nagasaki or Hiroshima after the bombers dropped, you see this devastated flatness with these spiky trees. And I just wonder, it could be fanciful, but I just wonder if there's some connection there.
Well, there are these shapes in the sky, and I suppose that interesting thing that it's never quite clear if it's a sun or a moon. And this feeling that often these pictures Perhaps this one. Well, here you see those spindles.
Yes,
Those who can see around the corner. In other paintings, or a black sun almost,
yes,
which is, I suppose,
yes,
Soleil Noir de la
yeah,
Mélancolie,
yeah.
and so on. So it's whether it's a mood he's bringing, or if he is actually painting or reimagining the night.
I think probably the latter. Yeah.
What about the palette? Because this is in part determined by the materials he has access to at a certain point. He's not buying expensive oil paints.
No. He went to Woolworths. He bought household paint. He said that Johnson's paint, which is what Woolworths always sold, that if you let it stand for a couple of months or so, all the oil floated to the top and you poured that off. And what was left underneath was really rather good pigment. Yeah.
But he didn't paint with household paints for the rest of his life.
No. In fact, if you track Bill's painting from 1958 to 2008, you see the increasing quality of the oil paint is amazing. Yeah. I mean, Bill could go to John Jones when John Jones ran an art materials shop in North London, and it was just like going around with I don't know, a chef in a rather fine cookery equipment shop, And he was extraordinarily extravagant in the quality of colour that he bought later on.
But at this point, it's quite raw. It's quite straight on the canvas. Not that many layers that often.
No.
Sometimes quite a dry brush as well.
And very much drawing on the painted surface. That's why so many of Bill's works of this period are oil on paper. And whether you're talking about an oil on painting or an oil on canvas, it's a painting or a drawing, because the two things are really fused together. Yeah.
He said later in life that I could never be an abstract artist because that doesn't start anywhere for me. Insofar as he had to have these moments, but he is at the same time working on things that, I mean, that may have been sort of 20 years later, but I'm thinking about works like these works from 1959 on newspaper here. Where do you think those are starting, or is it? Is it that he's experimenting with things?
I think that he pinned it down because, I mean, he was often taken to task like that. Surely your paintings are really very abstract. Where's the landscape element in them, etc. Where's the observed part of the image? And he said, no, there's an overlap of pictorial language. But my purpose is very different from that of the abstract artist. Mine is to use the languages that I'm using to express something else. Yeah.
So it's a type of, well, that's interesting because it's not a pure abstraction by any means. There's something about being able to express yourself, and an expression of emotion in forms. And yet he was not particularly drawn to the American painters of the time who became known as abstract expressionists.
And that was for two reasons. One, with the exception of de Kooning, he didn't rate any of them as being in the first order. Now that might seem strange to us because they had such a massive impression and effect on post-war British painting. But Bill really believed, long before Serge Guilbeault wrote it, that New York had stolen the idea of modern art. And he still took so much of his inspiration for a contemporary language of art from the School of Paris. And yet, when he saw American painting, he'd say, well, that's absolutely wonderful, beautiful. He'd be talking about a Barnett Newman. But
it's funny you mentioned Barnett Newman, because there's that other line of Bill's where he says, I would like an art that is as a razor slash. And I actually think of Barnett Newman's zip paintings.
Yes. But Bill meant it as a razor slash, across skin. Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking about going back to what you said about seeing the Flanders fields in the Essex countryside, in the burning stubble of the countryside. I mean, that, I suppose he wasn't necessarily reflecting so much on the Second War, but on the First War at that point. He later, in 1969, visits Bergen-Belsen, which is another very important moment for him in the relationship between his paintings and the history of the 20th century, the traumatic history of the 20th century. But would you say that this thinking about the First War, what was it that made him think about the First War?
He wasn't alone in that. I mean, you think of things like Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop. Oh, what a lovely war! Bill was an enormous admirer of Joan Littlewood. Everything she was trying to do. He was madly enthused by things like theatre, 784, all these sort of inclusive ways of making a statement. Just slightly later in the 1960s, that huge TV series, which older members of the audience may remember as I do, called The Great War. And that was a revelation. I mean, it was so shocking in the imagery that he used. And I, Bill, who I met afterwards, because he and I didn't get together until the 1970s, but he would talk about that series. And equally in his library, he got volumes and volumes of contemporary photographs of the First World War. So you ask where that interest had come from. I think it was simply that there were a number of issues around at the time, and that also it was part and parcel of his post-war mentality. I mean, he used to say, "Oh, the Second World War stole my youth." Yeah, so it was something that he carried with him as a not a problem, but just as a part of his mindset.
And clearly in some of the titles of the paintings that he made as the figure begins to emerge in about 1960, 61?
Yeah, 60, 61, yeah.
But this figure is sometimes a reclining figure, but sometimes quite an active figure eventually, but skeletal usually in some way.
Yeah.
Quite haunting and seems quite clearly linked to thinking about the battlefields of the First World War, among other things.
Except that, he resisted. He said, "Oh, I only use the term skeleton just as a term of convenience in speech. I never give my pictures those titles." And I resist it. And they were always called things like figure in a landscape, really neutral titles like that. And why? Because he said that when he painted a painting like that one or like that one without a figure, he wanted the image to have the sense of a human presence.
I've got the quote here. He says, I like to have the human presence without the human subject being there.
Yeah, that's
and I
right
suppose
in
there's
one.
also that
Yes.
moment of
Yeah.
when he gives a work to Ruth Borchardt, and it is what is figuratively a skeleton.
Yeah.
But the painting is called Self-Portrait.
Yes. Yeah. And they were very often called self-portraits.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they start. Sorry.
Was that part of a sense of humour as well?
No, it wasn't. It was deadly serious. And I mean, what she thought when she'd received all these nice grey conventional self-portraits of artists, so that you knew what each of them looked like, and she gets this bright red thing with the skeletal head from William Crozier, and she sent this terribly nice, polite response. I was very surprised to receive it, but I'm very charmed. You
see how quickly he's evolving. We were looking at the work behind us just before we sat down, and a different type of drawing is emerging here, insofar as there is a sense of outline I'm afraid I'll make the joke again, but the bare bones are outlined in this work, and it's amazing, really, how quickly stylistically he's, I think, evolving, and the colours are changing as well. This red coming into play, the blues, which weren't in all of the previous. There's quite a muddy palette in 1958, 59, and suddenly it's exploding into something else.
Yeah, and also his realization that colour was something that he could use for a completely visceral effect. And because he was Scottish and he used colour, people were frequently saying, he's in the tradition of the Scottish colourists. And he loved the Scottish colours, and he said, isn't it wonderful, they can make even Loch Lomond look like the Côte d'Azur. But they don't have colour plays no emotional role in their paintings, is what he said. Yeah, so he really wanted colour to be a means of engineering emotion in the viewer.
Did he talk specifically about particular colours and the emotions they carried for him?
No, never ever. I mean, he'd say things, they'd be throwaway remarks, which you knew were actually very serious remarks from him, in which he said, why do people go on about what colours will go with other colours? What colours are harmonious? I can make any colour work with another colour. But nothing else.
Just before we open the floor to some questions, if there are any, or we can keep talking. But just thinking about these landscapes or nature paintings, or however you want to describe them, as if you look at them in relation to the types of landscape that come after for Bill. So he goes to Spain in '63. That's very important. But of course, later to the west of Ireland, and eventually, I suppose, to quite Arcadian landscapes around Winchester as well. How do these things need to be sort of coalesced together? Do they need to relate to each other? Is there continuity?
No, I think you have to keep that statement in your head. Landscape is not the subject; it's the vehicle through which I can express different things. I mean, the big similarity, but also difference between, for instance, the later Irish paintings and these early works here, is that Bill was fascinated that any corner of any field where we lived in West Cork had got some historical resonance. Now, that links them with the way in which we've looked at the historical references in this early work. But Bill would bear that in mind, but again, there would be a moment when he'd see that corner of the field in some visionary way, and that would be the basis for making a painting back in the studio.
There is a corner of an Irish field
that is forever Crozier.
Yes.